The moment I stepped into the courtroom, my mother smirked. It was soft, almost hidden, but sharp as a blade, like she'd been waiting years to see me fall. My father looked away, his jaw tight, as if he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. Eleanor Hart. That's the name they'd turned into a whisper of shame, a stain on their perfect legacy. For so long I believed them. I let their judgment carve me hollow. But not today. Today, they were about to see exactly who their discarded daughter had become. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, sterile and unforgiving. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step a steady beat against the chaos pounding in my chest. I gripped the folder in my hand, 6 years of silence pressed into its pages. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. On the front bench, my mother, Beatrice, sat with her chin high, her lips curling just enough to let that smirk slip through. It wasn't laughter, not quite, but it cut deeper. My father, Victor, shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the wall as if I wasn't even there. The judge paused, his pen hovering over the desk, his gaze flickering toward me for a moment longer than it should have. I didn't need to hear the whispers, but I felt them. Is that her? The room seemed to lean in, curious, judgmental, alive with the weight of their stares. I kept walking. Each step echoed, deliberate, like a promise I'd made to myself long ago. The folder felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just paper, years of betrayal, of nights spent piecing together the truth. I met my mother's eyes just for a second and saw the flicker of certainty behind her smirk. She thought she'd won before I'd even spoken. My father's silence said the same. They believed I was here to beg, to crumble. They couldn't see that they were the ones on trial. When I reached the table, I set the folder down, the sound sharp in the stillness. My mother's smirk wavered just for a moment. My father's shoulders tensed. The judge cleared his throat but said nothing. I let the silence stretch, heavy, unyielding. Then I lifted my chin, my voice calm, steady, like a stone dropped into still water. "Let's begin," I said. And in that moment my mother's smirk faded. They thought they knew me. They were wrong. From the outside, we were the picture of perfection. The Hart family. Seattle's shining example of wealth and grace. My father, Victor Hart, was the silver-tongued king of Hart Wealth Management, a financial empire that glittered across the city's skyline. My mother, Beatrice, was the darling of charity galas, her smile captured in every society column, her elegance a mask no one dared to question. And Julian, my younger brother, the golden heir at 32, who could charm a room with a single glance. They were untouchable, flawless, or so the world thought. Behind closed doors the truth was jagged, like glass you didn't see until it cut you. I was 38, the eldest daughter, the one who worked in the shadows to keep the family's empire standing. I wasn't born with Julian's charm or my mother's poise. I had numbers, discipline, a mind that could untangle the chaos of markets and ledgers. For years I stood beside my father, balancing accounts, forecasting risks, believing that hard work could earn me a place in their world. I was wrong. It was 2015 when the financial markets trembled. Hart Wealth Management teetered on the edge of collapse. My father's health was failing, his hands shaking too much to sign the papers that kept the company alive. So I stepped in. I poured everything I had, $300,000 of my own savings, to stabilize the firm. I worked nights, weekends, making sure every client was secure, every employee paid. I thought I was saving us, not just the company. I thought loyalty would bind us closer. But 3 months later, when the profits returned and the firm stood tall again, they called me into the boardroom. The air was thick, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. My father sat at the head of the table, his eyes avoiding mine. My mother stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the Seattle skyline. Julian leaned back in his chair, his smirk a mirror of hers. "You're out, Eleanor," my father said, his voice flat like he was reading a script. The official reason? Incompetence, failure to lead. The real reason? I'd become a threat, a reminder that their empire didn't need them as much as they thought. That night, we sat at the family's polished mahogany table, the chandelier above us casting light that felt more like a spotlight. My mother sliced her steak with delicate precision, her voice soft but venomous. You were meant to follow, Eleanor, not to lead. Her words landed like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I laughed, a quiet sound because letting the rage spill out would have proven her right. Julian raised his glass, his eyes glinting. To the future, he said, as if I wasn't part of it. My father said nothing, just stared at his plate, the weight of his silence heavier than any words. I left that night with nothing but a thin folder of financial statements, the ones I'd spent years perfecting. The ones that proved I'd saved them. As I walked out, the door clicked shut behind me, and something inside me hardened. Not into anger, but into resolve. They thought they'd erased me. They thought I'd disappear. But I was already planning, already waiting for the moment they'd face the truth they'd built on lies. For years, I carried that folder like a wound and a weapon. I moved into a small apartment in Capitol Hill, far from the glittering world of heartfelt management. I took freelance consulting jobs, piecing together a life from the scraps they'd left me. But every night I'd open that folder, tracing the numbers, the dates, the proof that I'd been more than they'd ever admit. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the truth, for the part of me they'd tried to bury. I remembered the summers at Puget Sound, when my grandmother, Margaret Hart, would walk with me along the shore. She'd point to the water, smooth as glass, and say, "Truth doesn't sink, Eleanor. It waits." She was the only one who saw me, who believed I could be more than the family's shadow. When she died, I thought I'd lost her faith too. The will read in court named Julian as the sole heir to her estate, her properties, her investments, her legacy. I'd mourned that loss more than her death itself, believing she'd turned away from me too. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her words echoed in my mind, steady, unyielding. Truth doesn't sink. I didn't know it then, but I was already on the path to finding it. The path that would lead me back to that courtroom, to the moment my mother's smirk would falter, to the day I'd stand taller than their lies. They thought they'd written my story, that I'd fade into the background like a forgotten line. But I was rewriting it page by page, and I wasn't alone. The truth was waiting, and it was sharper than any blade they'd ever wielded against me. I just had to find it. And when I did, they'd learn what it meant to underestimate me. 4 years after I walked away from that chandelier-lit dinner, I was living a quiet life in my Capitol Hill apartment, the kind of place where the walls creaked with every gust of Seattle wind. The city's hum was my companion, but so was the folder of financial statements I kept in a locked drawer. I'd trace those pages at night, each number a reminder of what I'd lost, what I'd saved. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, until one evening, when everything changed. I came home to find a plain envelope slipped under my door. No stamp, no return address, just my name, Eleanor Hart, scrawled across the front in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. My grandmother's, Margaret Hart. My fingers shook as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, the ink faded but unmistakable. It was her will, the real one, signed in her sharp, elegant script. Every asset, her properties along Puget Sound, her shares in heartfelt management, her entire legacy, was left to me. Not Julian. Me. I sat on the floor, the paper trembling in my hands. When my grandmother died, the will read in court had named Julian the sole heir. I'd believed it. I'd carried that betrayal like a stone in my chest, thinking even she had turned away from me. But this was the truth she'd hidden, the truth she'd trusted me to find. My phone buzzed, sharp and sudden, pulling me back. "Eleanor Hart?" a woman's voice asked, low and cautious. My name's Nora Klein. I worked with your grandmother's lawyer. We need to talk. Nora's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like she was holding something back. She told me her story in fragments. She'd been a junior paralegal at the law firm that handled Margaret's estate. 15 years ago, after refusing to alter the will, the head lawyer vanished. Nora had always suspected foul play. Your grandmother knew, she said. She hid the real will, told me to keep it safe until you were ready. My pulse hammered in my ears. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a crime. The next morning, I met Nora at a small coffee shop by the waterfront, the kind of place where the fog clung to the windows and no one lingered long enough to eavesdrop. She slid a scratched USB drive across the table, her hands steady but her eyes darting to the door. This was in a box marked for shredding, she said. I found it last month. I plugged it into my laptop, my breath catching as static crackled through the speakers. Then came my grandmother's voice, frail but fierce. Victor and Beatrice forced the change. I was too weak to fight them, but I kept the original for Eleanor. She'll know what to do. The world tilted. The coffee shop's hum faded, leaving only the echo of her words. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me. She'd believed in me, even when I doubted myself. Nora turned her laptop toward me, pulling up a scanned document. This is the fake will, she said. They lifted Margaret's signature from an old contract. It's a cut-and-paste job, but it fooled the court. I studied the ink strokes, her familiar cursive twisted into their lie. Rage flared, then settled into something colder, clearer. You can fake a signature, I thought, but you can't fake a legacy. I went home and dug through an old box I'd kept from my grandmother's house. Inside I found bank statements from the 1990s, yellowed but intact. One line caught my eye. Account holder, Margaret Hart and Eleanor Hart. My name right there tied to her trust. But when I checked the bank's digital records, it was gone, erased like I'd never existed. Someone with power did that, Nora said when I called her. I took screenshots, saved them to an encrypted drive, and felt the weight of what was coming. What now? Nora asked. I stared at the folder on my desk, the one I'd carried for years. Now, I said, we do this right. No chaos, no revenge, just the truth. 3 weeks later, Nora and I drove to a nursing home on the outskirts of Seattle, where the air smelled of rain and cedar. Mrs. Clara, my grandmother's former assistant, sat in a rocking chair, her hands folded over a faded quilt. Her eyes lit up when I showed her a photograph she'd sent me years ago, one I'd almost forgotten. Margaret signed that will in her study, Clara said, her voice soft but sure. I took this picture. Your mother was there, standing behind her, watching every move. She pulled a worn album from a drawer, flipping to the last page. There it was, my grandmother, pen in hand, the lawyer beside her, and Beatrice, her gaze cold and calculating, caught in the frame. My breath stopped. Would you testify? I asked. Clara's eyes met mine, steady as stone. If the court calls, I'll speak. But Eleanor, they burned every original. This photo is all I have. On the drive back, the sky was heavy, grey as slate. Nora's voice was barely a whisper. If Clara still has that photo, they'll come for it. She was right. That night, I opened my apartment door to find chaos. Drawers yanked open, papers scattered, my laptop smashed. But on my desk, untouched, was a single sheet of paper. Truth doesn't change the past, it read, in handwriting I didn't recognise. My heart pounded, but not with fear. It was a warning, yes, but it felt like something else. A challenge. A reminder. I sank into a chair, the weight of it all pressing down. They thought I'd break, that I'd run. But they didn't know me. Not anymore. I thought of my grandmother, her voice on that USB, her faith in me. I thought of the walks along Puget Sound, her hand in mine, her words like a lighthouse in the fog. Truth doesn't sink. I picked up the photograph, the one Clara had saved, and tucked it into the folder. It wasn't just evidence. It was proof that I wasn't alone. that I never had been. The next morning, I wrote across the envelope in steady ink, "Patience is truth's sharpest edge," because for the first time I understood. The Harts hadn't just stolen from me. They'd built their empire on a lie, and I was done letting it stand. The truth was waiting, and I was ready to carry it into the light. The courthouse in Seattle loomed under a sky heavy with clouds, its white stone facade glowing faintly under the morning light. Cameras flashed outside, reporters murmuring the name Hart Wealth Management like it was already a headline. I walked through the chaos, my black coat brushing against my knees, my heels slicing through the noise with every step. Inside the air was still, thick with anticipation. My mother Beatrice sat ramrod straight, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass. My father Victor stared at his hands, his face a mask of controlled shame. Julian, my brother, leaned back in his chair, his confidence unshaken, as if this was just another game he'd win. Their attorney caught my eye and sneered. "You're out of your depth, Miss Hart," he said. I looked at him, calm, steady. "I'm not here to swim," I said. "I'm here to surface the truth." The judge, a woman with silver hair and eyes like steel, called the room to order. I set my folder down, its weight grounding me. 6 years of silence, now ready to speak. I started with the photograph from Clara, the one showing my mother standing behind my grandmother as she signed the real will. The room stirred, whispers rippling like water. Beatrice's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Then came the USB. I plugged it in, and my grandmother's voice filled the courtroom, frail but fierce. Victor and Beatrice forced the change. I kept the original for Eleanor. The air snapped tight. My father's hands clenched. Julian's jaw twitched. The judge leaned forward, her pen still. Then came the twist. Nora Klein stepped forward, her presence quiet but commanding. The room expected a former paralegal, a minor player in this drama. But Nora wasn't just that. "I wasn't only Margaret's paralegal," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the silence. "I was her friend. For 20 years. She trusted me with her truth." She paused, her eyes locking with mine. "Before she died, she gave me that letter, told me to wait until Eleanor was ready. She knew you'd fight for this." The courtroom froze. My mother's face drained of colour. Julian sat up, his arrogance crumbling. Nora wasn't just a witness. She was the keeper of my grandmother's faith in me, the one who'd carried her secret all these years. I handed the judge the scanned fake will, the one with my grandmother's signature cut and pasted from an old contract. "They didn't just steal from me," I said, my voice low but clear. They stole her voice. The judge's eyes narrowed as she studied the document. Then I played the final piece. A recording, sent by Nora, captured just weeks ago. My father's voice, calm and calculated, echoed through the speakers. "We're protecting the family name, Nora. Name your price, and this ends." The room gasped. Beatrice shot to her feet, shouting, "That's fabricated!" But the judge's gavel slammed down, silencing her. The truth didn't need to shout. It was already deafening. I stood, placing a sealed envelope before the judge. Inside was a letter from my grandmother, written in her final days. The clerk read it aloud, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of the words. "If Eleanor stands before you, she has carried more than this family ever deserved. Give her what's hers." The judge's eyes softened just for a moment before she spoke. "This isn't a dispute. It's a crime." The words hit like thunder. Their attorney slumped in his seat. My mother's hands trembled, her smirk gone. Julian stared at me, his voice barely a whisper. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The trial stretched into the afternoon, the courtroom heavy with the hum of whispered tension. Sunlight slipped through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden table where my folder lay. The judge's voice broke the silence, calm, final. "The court recognises the original will of Margaret Hart. Hart Wealth Management and all related assets are to be returned to Eleanor Hart. The defendants, Victor, Beatrice and Julian Hart, are referred to the federal prosecutor for charges of forgery and obstruction of justice. The room erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, their voices blending into a roar. My mother's sob cracked the air, sharp and raw. My father's shoulders caved, his silence louder than ever. Julian leaned forward, his face pale. "You won, Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking. "But we've lost everything." I met his gaze, my voice quiet but firm. "I didn't take anything. I just gave back what you broke." The gavel struck one last time, a sound like a door closing on their lies. As I gathered my files, the judge descended from her bench. She stopped beside me, her hand light on my shoulder. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. I nodded, my throat tight. "She already is." For a moment the years folded back. I saw my grandmother's face, her hand in mine by Puget Sound, her voice whispering, "Truth doesn't sink." The courtroom's weight lifted, replaced by something lighter, clearer. I walked out, the echo of my heels fading into the hum of the city outside. They'd smirked when I walked in. They weren't smirking now. The courthouse doors swung shut behind me, muffling the chaos of reporters and flashing cameras. The Seattle air was crisp, tasting of salt and rain as I stepped into the late afternoon light. The city hummed, alive and indifferent, its skyline stretching out like a memory I no longer needed to carry. I didn't smile. I didn't raise my hands in triumph. I just walked forward, letting the wind lift the edge of my scarf. For the first time in years, the weight in my chest was gone. Not victory, peace. I didn't keep the assets for myself. Hart Wealth Management, the properties, the legacy, they weren't what I'd fought for. A month after the trial, I founded the Margaret Hart Foundation, dedicated to helping those manipulated out of their inheritances, their voices silenced by greed. I poured the wealth into it, every dollar a step toward something bigger than revenge. I wanted to build what my grandmother had believed in, a legacy of truth, not power. The work wasn't easy, but it was honest. It felt right. I started speaking at financial conferences across Seattle, sharing my story not as a victim, but as someone who'd found her way back. People listened, their eyes wide, their questions careful. One evening, a young woman approached me after a talk, her hands twisting nervously. "How do you forgive them?" she asked. I paused, the question heavier than she knew. I thought of my mother's smirk, my father's silence, Julian's arrogance. I thought of the years I'd spent believing their lies about me. "Forgiveness isn't about letting them go," I said, my voice soft. "It's about letting yourself live." She nodded, her eyes bright with tears, and I felt it again, that quiet peace, settling deeper. One clear evening I drove to Puget Sound, to the stretch of beach where my grandmother used to walk with me. The water was smooth, reflecting a sky streaked with gold and pink. I sat on a weathered bench, the wood cool beneath my hands, and pulled her letter from my pocket, the one Nora had given me, the one that started it all. Its edges were worn, the ink fading, but her words still burned bright. "Truth doesn't sink, Eleanor." I flicked open a small silver lighter, the flame catching the twilight's glow. I held the letter to the fire, watching it curl and blacken, the ashes drifting out over the water. They scattered, carried away by the wind, into silence. I didn't need the paper anymore. Its truth was part of me now. The trial, the evidence, the years of pain, they'd led me here, to this moment, to this bench where I could finally breathe. I thought of my grandmother, her hand in mine, her voice steady as the tide. She'd known I'd find my way. She'd known I'd stand taller than their lies. The waves lapped gently against the shore, their rhythm like a heartbeat, steady and alive. I closed my eyes, letting the sound fill me. For the first time in years, the quiet wasn't empty. It was full, warm, forgiven. Now I speak at community centres, not just conferences, teaching people how to protect their legacies, how to fight for what's theirs. The press called my story The Silent Tide, and I let them. It fit. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be. During one talk, a reporter leaned forward, her pen poised. Do you ever see them? Your family? I smiled, not for her, but for myself. I see them in the past, I said, and that's where they stay. The sun dipped lower, painting the water gold. I stood, brushing sand from my coat, and walked along the shore. The wind carried the faint scent of cedar, the same as it had all those years ago with my grandmother. I thought of her words, written across that envelope in my own steady hand. Patience is truth's sharpest edge. I'd carried it, honed it, used it to carve out this moment. They'd smirked when I walked in. I walked out free, and in that freedom I found something I hadn't expected. Not just peace, but purpose. The light danced across the water, unyielding like the truth itself. I kept walking, the horizon open before me, and for the first time I wasn't looking back.